All right. Good evening. Hope everybody could hear me. Hope everybody could see me well. Hope the connection is good. If there's any issues, please put it in the comments, and we'll try to get through this class without any disturbances, God willing. Hold on one second. Already starting. There we go. So this week's class is dedicated in honor of all the people, all the Jewish people, wherever they may be, who need protection, the hostages be released, and the soldiers on the front lines. Let's get into it. So in this week's Torah portion, we have 10 commandments. The 10 commandments, not 10 commandments. We have the 10 commandments. The Jewish people leave Egypt. In last week's Torah portion, the sea splits. And in this week, the Torah portion, they get to Mount Sinai, and God tells them the 10 commandments. So let's get into what are the 10 commandments. We have 2 tablets, and the 2 tablets each have 5 commandments, and each one is a little bit, each tablet kind of has a theme. The first tablet, one second. The first tablet is really more things that are between God and man. That's really what the first tablet is. I am the Lord your God. You should not have any other. You should not have any idols. Do not take God's name in vain. Remember the Shabbos, and honor your father and mother. Which, honor your father and mother is kind of a little bit of both. It's a commandment from God. Obviously, it has to do with people as well. But the first tablet the first 5 is mostly between man and God, and the second tablet is don't kill, don't commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, and do not covet. So those are obviously between man and another man. So let's get into it. What is the difference between these 2 sets of 5 tablets? So the first thing is that the 10 commandments were initially said by God. They were said by God in one breath. Obviously, that is something that is not possible. The 10 commandments are not, it's a decent amount of words. It's not physically possible to hear such a thing. And the Jewish people somehow, we're not really sure how it happened, but it happened. God said all the 10 commandments. And then he said individually, he said the first 2 commandments. After that, the Jewish people couldn't handle it. And Moses was given the job of saying the last 8 commandments directed by God. So, but really those 2 commandments are really, if you want to say the 10 commandments are general commandments, not just as individual commandments, but for the whole Torah, kind of a concise version of the Torah, if you want to say, then the first 2 commandments are even more concise. It's all the positive commandments fall under the category of I am the Lord your God. That's a positive commandment, to believe in God. Then there's the second commandment, is do not have any other idols, which all other negative commandments, things that we don't do, fall under that category. Okay, so now that we got into this idea, if you want to think about it, if you're God and you have 10 things to say to the world, right? I am Lord your God makes sense. I would say the first 4 commandments definitely make sense. Even the first 5 commandments, right? Honor your mother and father and mother. Those are the 10 things you have to say to the world. But don't kill, don't steal. These are things that, in fact, the Torah tells us, the Talmud tells us, these are things that we could have figured out on our own. We could have even, figured them out from animals. There are animals that conduct themselves in immoral ways. Cats are modest. Doves are faithful. Ants don't steal from each other. But really, what we're seeing from this idea is that God is saying, if you want to be a moral person, if you want to be a person who doesn't kill, who doesn't steal, who doesn't commit adultery, who doesn't covet his friend, you need to have a connection to God first. And really, we see this in our times, going back less than 100 years ago, less than 80 years ago, where we had Germany, which was considered a very modern, moral country, society, and and we saw what they were capable of when they took God out of the equation. And their morality ended up becoming, because their morality wasn't based on God-given by God-given wasn't God-given commandments. Their morality became based on, Deutschland über alles, right? That Germany above everything else, and they were able to justify. They were able to justify their mass murder, genocide, and all kinds of awful, terrible things. And some of them were very well educated. The Rebbe actually spoke about this idea that when he lived in Germany in the 1930s, and he said that in his experience they were extremely well educated about philosophy. He said they knew Kant, they knew I forget all the name of these philosophers, but essentially he saw them as, and then Hitler came and he made this theory for them, or this way of life, and they embraced it, not by rejecting those philosophies, but as a continuation of those philosophies. They felt that they didn't see the contradiction between these big philosophers of in Russia, and these German and Russian philosophers. They didn't see the contradiction between that and Hitler's philosophy. And because they didn't, again, because they wasn't grounded in God. So once it becomes not grounded in yourself and your own selfish ideas, then there's really nothing stopping you from your ulterior motives will push you to justify anything. And so that is really why it's so important that God told us these 10 commandments. These 10 commandments are not just, really holy super things, but really basic morality has to be God driven. It cannot just be mind driven. Now, in fact, not only did Germany become a repulsive place, but it wasn't something that was, okay, a few people went wrong. This was an entire society that embraced, majority of Germany embraced that. The idea that they didn't know and all that is pretty historically inaccurate. The Rebbe himself, that he lived in Germany at that time, he said in his estimation, he felt that it was 99% of Germans agreed with Hitler. At least he lived in Berlin. And that is something that is really unbelievable if you think about it. And another thing that the Rebbe pointed out was, if you look in the foundational ethical work of the Torah, is in the Mishnah. We have the ethics of our fathers, Pirkei Avot, that is actually placed in the it's placed at the end of there's six, I don't know how you say in English, 6 Siddharim of the Mishnah. There's 6 tracks of the Mishnah. They're divided, all the different tractates are divided into 6 tracks, and the track of damages, at the end of it comes the tractate of Avot, of the ethics of our fathers, which again enforces this idea that damages which seemingly seem like the opposite, legalese, what do you do when you have a dispute with somebody? What do you do when you damage someone's property? These would seem to be, very legal, okay, how do I behave myself, essentially, kind of things. Why would that fall into the category of morality? But really, that's the truth, is that if you want to behave yourself and act like a moral person, it has to be based on ethics. It has to be based on not just ethics, but God-given ethics, which is in Pirkei Avot. This right away, it begins with the Masorah, the tradition of the Torah. How did the Torah come to be? Because God gave it to Moses, and Moses gave it to Joshua, and Joshua gave it to the prophets, and so on. And that's really the only way that we can be moral humans and moral people, is through is to recognizing that our morality, it's not enough to just be moral because it makes sense. It's not because that could be corrupted. It's not just enough to be moral because it's good for us, because again, that could be corrupted. And we see it going on now with what's going on in the world. We see how people are justifying terrible atrocities that occurred just a few months ago in Israel, and people are justifying that by, okay, there's a justification, they have the right, and all this nonsensical, immoral thinking. They could justify it and say, no, we're more moral, because they don't recognize that morality has to be God given. And again, that's not to say that people who are not religious can't be moral. Obviously, every rule has exceptions, but on a you could maybe you want to say that maybe even on a deeper level, they really understand that these are God-given ethics. But no matter how you look at it, in the end of the day, we see that every single society that tried, it failed. And now this doesn't just apply to the Jewish people, the Ten Commandments. While the entire world, the Torah tells us that the entire world was quiet and heard the Ten Commandments, and actually the Torah portion begins with Jethro coming and saying that he heard the Ten Commandments and he had heard about it, and the whole world was changed by the idea of the Ten Commandments. Specifically, we know that when God came down to this world, it was kind of like the world and the physical world and the spiritual realm were like two different entities. There was the God entity and the people entity, and they didn't mix. They couldn't communicate with each other. And by God coming down on Mount Sinai and Moses going up the mountain, this broke those barriers. And now physicality, materialism was able to be changed and made spiritual into a spiritual. We can make a spiritual domain and a home for God in this physical material world, which really, again, going back to this theme that we're sticking with tonight, is that we actually can make this physical material world a home for God, specifically through the material. In other words, specifically through those last 5 commandments of realizing that if we treat people correctly, through knowledge that this is a God-given ability, which is something that occurred because of Sinai, that's how we really can make this world a spiritual place, not just through the holy things that we do, but specifically through the physical material things and how we interact with people. And this doesn't just apply, as we said, doesn't just apply to the Jewish people, even though the 10 Commandments were given primarily to the Jewish people. There are 7 commandments that were given to Noah post the flood that are for all people. And Maimonides says, in Laws of Kings, chapter 8, he says, anybody who accepts upon himself the fulfillment of these 7 commandments and is precise in their observance is considered the pious amongst the Gentiles and will merit a share in the world to come. So we're the only religion that doesn't believe that you have to be Jewish to go to heaven. All right. Every other religion, they say that they have a monopoly on heaven. We say they don't have to be Jewish to be if you're Jewish, you need maybe you need to fulfill the commandments to go to heaven. But if you're a non-Jew, you only have to keep 7 commandments to be basic morality. Now, Maimonides continues and says, however, this applies only. Sorry, 1 second. Whoa. Okay. Sorry, we have a guest joining us. Okay, there we go. So Maimonides says this only applies when the Gentile accepts them and fulfills them, because God commanded them in the Torah and informed us through Moses, our teacher, that Noah's descendants have been commanded to fulfill them previously. However, if he fulfills them out of intellectual conviction, he is not one of the pious among Gentiles, nor of their wise men. So it's even for Gentiles, they have to keep the 7 laws because of Sinai. They have to keep the 7 laws because God told them to, not because Moses told us to tell the non-Jewish people and to be a light amongst the nations and to teach them. But we can't. They can't be considered righteous if they have morality, which again, the 7 Noahide laws are very similar to the 10 Commandments. Have courts of justice, don't kill, don't steal, believe one God, don't eat animals that are still alive. Basic morality that applies to all people, but there has to be because God said so. If you don't do it because God said, they're not considered righteous and they're not even considered wise, Maimonides says. And our job as a Jewish people is to teach the nations of the world this idea that that we have to be moral, and we have to be moral because God told us we have to be moral, because it's the only way that a society could stay together. So again, we see here this idea that the world, if we want to really say what is the message of Sinai that we talk about in this week's Torah portion, the message of Sinai is, number one, that you cannot, that the world has changed, that now materialism, physicality, our realm can be changed and made into a home for God. It must be made into a home for God. And I think the other part of that is, the only way we can do that, the only way we can make the world a better place, is through godliness.